All right, hello, this is Oxford Echoes, and I figured as an introductory video I would tell you my story of how I became Anglican. And so I was raised nominally Protestant. I would say for the most part, my home church would have been United Methodist. And it was very liturgical Methodist or high church Methodist. So in other words, it wasn't on the evangelical side. Unfortunately, the church that I am talking about, they have changed, and it's still a United Methodist church, but they are no longer that way. They're more evangelical. So for the most part, that's what I was raised in. Until I was in my late teens when I began to doubt. And you know, the atheist movement was big on YouTube at this time. This was 2010 or so. And so this kind of convinced me that Christianity and religion were false. I became convinced of some arguments that just necessarily weren't true. If any of you remember the Zeitgeist movie, which now has been debunked, but when I saw it, I was convinced. I definitely should have done further research. And then there were things in the Old Testament that I read and didn't really understand the context of that that were used to convince me that, you know, religion wasn't true, especially Christianity. And I sought out other religions at first. I didn't intend on being an atheist, but it wasn't my goal. So I looked into Islam, I looked into paganism, and none of these things really had an appeal. And eventually I became a deist for a while. And then eventually that just led me all the way to atheism. And so I was an atheist for 10 to 11 years. And there was a situation that happened where I had to forgive someone close to me, and someone was asking for forgiveness, rather. And I didn't want to do it at first, but then I just had this kind of experience that just was saying to me, you know, forgive them. And it was like what the Bible says when it says the heart of stone was removed and replaced with a heart of flesh. And that's exactly what happened. And I began to look into Marcionism at this time, because I still had problems with the Old Testament. And so I had just become aware of Marcionism, which is Christianity. It's a heresy, but it's based on the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament being different gods. And I kind of got into that for a little while, you know, for a few months. Until I started to, it was like I was on YouTube and I was looking up some things that had to do with the Bible, and YouTube recommended me some Fulton Sheen videos, and I was incredibly inspired by Fulton Sheen. And I looked at his TV show that was on the air in the 60s, and I watched a lot of his sermons, and I became convinced that I should become a Catholic. So I didn't know how to become a Catholic. I didn't know what that was like. I had no idea. I emailed a few of the local Catholic churches around me, and it just so happens that RCIA was starting, which is Rite of Christian Initiation for Adults. And it is how you become Catholic. And it was starting like 2 or 3 weeks from when I sent that email. So I signed up for that and I went. Along the way, I discovered, well, I should take a step back. I initially wanted to return to the Methodist Church. And I don't want this video to be attacking other denominations. But when I saw what was going on in the Methodist Church, this is one of the reasons that pushed me all the way to Roman Catholicism, because, you know, there was this huge split between the United Methodist Church and the Global Methodist Church was breaking away. And there's a documentary on YouTube about this, where the conservatives in the church won the vote and still ran away to start their own church because the bishops would not enforce the rules. So this kind of pushed me very far away from this sort of thing. It pushed me away from Protestantism. And I said, no, I don't want any part of that. Along with finding Fulton Sheen on YouTube, I said, no, I need to become a Catholic. So I did. I attended RCIA. This lasted about 8 months, and I had never been baptized, which is weird because, you know, Methodists do infant baptism, and my family were Methodists. My grandfather was a Methodist pastor, but I was never baptized. So I went all the way through RCIA. I could probably make another video about what RCIA is like. I began to read the Douay-Rheims Bible. We went through the Catechism. I was also doing the Bible in a Year with Father Mike Schmitz, and I did not finish that during RCIA, but I did finish it afterwards while I was still Roman Catholic. And I started going to Mass. I went to Mass after RCIA. My job had changed to where I could finally, because I used to work on Sundays, so I couldn't go to Mass. But my job changed where I could finally go. And I went. The same church I was at RCIA at. And I started a new job, as I said. And I was going to work one Sunday, Saturday night all the way through Sunday morning. I was getting off at like 7 a.m. on Sunday morning. And I had known about this Episcopal church that's just right across the street. The church I'm talking about is the oldest church in the city. It was built in 1826, and I really wanted to see what that was like, because I don't think I've ever been in a building that old. So I looked at their website and I thought, you know, I'll go to this church, and then after I'll go to Mass at the Roman Catholic Church where I'm a member. Because if I go home and I have to wait until 10 o'clock, you know, I'm probably just going to be tired because I've been working all night. So I'll go to this church first, the Episcopal Church. It'll help me blow off some time, and I get to see the historic building, and then I can go to my real church. When I went to the Episcopal Church, I sat in the pew and I looked at the Book of Common Prayer, and I kind of fell in love with it because it was so clear and it explained the Mass in such a way that I had never really understood it before. And that kind of stuff wasn't really taught in RCIA. So I thought, okay, I know they do a general confession here. I saw it in the Book of Common Prayer. And I thought, you know what, if I feel forgiven, if I feel like that worked the same way private confession has worked or felt for me in the Roman Catholic Church, I'll give this a shot. Oh, by the way, I should mention, the service I went to was not in the historic building. It was in the chapel, which is not so old. So I also had thought, well, I got to come back because I still want to see the historic building. But anyway, during the service, I went through the confession, and when the priest granted us absolution, I felt the weight lifted off my shoulders the same way that I felt during private confession. And I realized confession doesn't need to be private because I know what I felt. I thought, well, God's working in this place. I can feel him here. So I went up to take the Eucharist, or I should say receive the Eucharist. And I felt God's presence in the Eucharist too. And at this point, I really didn't know what to do because, you know, the Episcopal Church has a bad reputation, especially online with Roman Catholics and in the groups I was in and whatnot. We can talk about that more in another video. I really didn't know what to do. And when I went back to the Episcopal Church the following week, I went to the 10 a.m. service so I could see the historic building. And this service blew me away even more because it had the procession, it had the wonderful organ music. I still took a look at the Book of Common Prayer, and I definitely decided I was going to buy one for myself. And I just felt God's presence, especially as we were singing the hymns as the procession was happening. And I began to look into Anglican Catholicism. And like I said, I don't want to attack other denominations, so I'm not going to go there, but I felt like it was a better fit. So I attended for a few months, and then I was received into the Episcopal Church. It kind of felt bad in a way because you devote all this time to, you know, going to RCIA and being so enthusiastic about being a Roman Catholic, and then, you know, shortly after being baptized, you're out of there. I still call myself a Catholic. I'm still a Catholic, but I just don't call myself a Roman Catholic. And it's still the case that if I weren't going to be an Anglican of any sort, I would probably go back to the Roman Catholic Church because that's just where my theology is. I still pray the rosary. I still read from the Douay Rheims. I do a lot of Catholic stuff. It's just that in some ways, in a lot of ways, I feel like Anglican Catholicism is closer to true Catholicism. But yeah, that's my story. And I'm going to make more reviews. I'm going to do a lot of prayer book reviews and Bible reviews. And if any other topics come to mind, or if you have any suggestions, let me know. Or if I come up with something, I'll do that. But thank you for watching.